Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm El Kamihira. This episode is another installment in our witch-themed conversations. And by that, I mean talking about places in the world and times in history where women and some men have been violently persecuted for so-called witchcraft. For me, there are so many interesting aspects of these recurring phenomena of witch hunting across the world. I think so much can be found in studying these events, how they unfold, who is doing the accusing and who's being accused, how power is wielded against women in particular, a lot about misogyny, about how the patriarchal machine works, the forces that makes women vulnerable to scapegoating and violence, the use of religious narratives for control, and so much more. And that is exactly what my guests on this episode, novelist Zoe Venditozzi and human rights attorney Claire Mitchell, write about in their fascinating new book, How to Kill a Witch, The Patriarchy's Guide to Silencing Women. The witch hunts we're talking about today took place in Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries. And Zoe and Claire, Scotswomen both, viciously funny Scotswomen, I have to add. In fact, you'll hear me trying to stifle my giggles through the entire episode, have spent the last 7 years digging deep into Scotland's prolific history of witch trials and executions. A history that was up to now virtually unknown and not at all taught in schools. But aside from the book, Claire and Zoe not only helped mobilize a countrywide research project to unearth this relatively unknown chapter of Scottish history, but they've also been documenting their journey of discovery into this past on their amazing podcast, Witches of Scotland. Highly recommend. So in this episode, we talk about all of their projects of unpacking how these terrifying schemes spread across Scotland, their campaign to officially acknowledge the thousands of innocent victims of the witch craze, but also about the importance of remembering and memorializing, and about making connections between this past and our present time, as the forces that were at play hundreds of years ago are very much alive today. Thanks for making time for me. I know it's a busy time of year, and congratulations on the success of the book. I know you've been very busy making appearances and book tour. And
yeah, it's been crazy. I have to apologise that I'm lying down, just in case you wonder what I'm doing. I'm staying in one of these pod hotels in central London. I can sit up, but I have to cross my legs and don't want to shuffle about.
No worries at all. It sounds like the perfect little audio studio, actually.
It is. It's, they're supposed to be soundproof. I am having the best sleep that I have had in years. So when I come back, Zoe has said, she's described it as a coffin. I don't think that's right. But I want an oak panel little pod.
Yeah,
that's good.
Maybe like those beds that they used to have in the olden days that I think was more about keeping the heat in, but the ones that were the box beds.
Keep my menopausal heat in. I'll cook like a turkey.
Yeah.
So sorry. I'm so sorry. I've dragging everyone off piste already.
No worries at all. So I am super excited to talk to you. I've been interested in the witch craze, the witch trials, the witch hunting for a long time, and it's been part of this podcast too. And I was so excited when I discovered your podcast, Witches of Scotland, and then have just been immersing myself in all your things. And so I would love to, and I know my listeners would love to get an understanding of how did you become interested in this? What prompted the whole thing, the campaign, the podcast, the book?
So I work as a lawyer in Scotland, and I was working for many, many years on cases involving miscarriages of justice. And where you work in Scotland is in the Old Town in Edinburgh, just off the Royal Mile, and it's hugely atmospheric. And the courts date from the 18th century. The place that the courts are on date back from the 16th century. There was a big fire that burnt everything down, but you're literally standing where people stood, 500 years ago and did court cases. And so all those things mean that when you're living and working in the Old Town in Edinburgh, you're acutely aware of history, of the history of the place that's there. And so that was going on in one part of my life. Another part of my life, I was reading a book by a woman called Sarah Sheridan, and the book's called Where Are the Women? And it reimagines Scotland as a place where every street's named after a woman, every statue is named after a woman, every municipal building is named after a woman, and tells the story of that woman. And after I'd read that book, I realised how few places in public spaces in Scotland actually represented women's history. There's a lot of histories of battles, there's a lot of history of men, and of course women were involved in battles, women were involved in those things, but their stories aren't told. It's the story of the soldier, it's the story of the people who have lost their life, and absolutely those people's stories should be told. I think definitely, particularly if you've given your life for your country, that's a huge thing and those names should be remembered. But also there were a lot of women making a lot of sacrifices as well, and we don't hear about their stories, and it's not recorded in public spaces. So I was also researching witchcraft trials at that time because there was a prosecutor, Scotland's top prosecutor was a man at the time of the witchcraft trials called the Bloody Mackenzie, and he was known for being fearsome with his enemies. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to find out what he thought of the witchcraft trials, and I was researching him. And apparently, for a man called the Bloody Mackenzie, he was actually very measured about witchcraft accusations. He didn't think everyone that was accused was witches. He was quite measured. So all those things came together one day when I was walking in Princes Street Gardens. And I was looking around, muttering to myself, no doubt, with my two wee dogs, thinking, where are the women? There's no statues to women here. There's no named women at all in the whole of Edinburgh's main green public space. It's crazy. We're half the population, over half the population, in fact. Where is any part of our story at all? And I got to the top of Princes Street Gardens and I looked and I saw a full-size statue of a bear called Wojciech. And Wojciech was sent to us by the Polish government in recognition of the help between the Poles and the Scots during the war. But the story was of Wojciech and the bear, and I was like, this is crazy. I know the story of a bear during the war, but I don't know any stories of women. And I looked right up above where Wojciech's head was, and I thought, I know hundreds of women, mostly women, were put to death there. Hundreds of women, thousands across Scotland. Nobody talks about it. We don't reflect on our history of it. We're not taught about it. And I decided I wanted to do something about it. So all the sort of ideas came to a head at once. And then, magically, I met Zoe.
Not actually magically.
Wow.
That's actually quite problematic if it turned out at this point in the campaign I went, well, actually, guys,
Magic.
We are
I've got powers, as it turns out. I'm not magical. Not in that sense anyway. I'm magical in many ways, but not in an actually doing magic sense. But Claire and I met at our friend Mel and Drew's wedding. And, you know, it's like as you get older, it can be a bit hard to make new friends, I think, sometimes.
Oh, Zoe.
Well, you know, Claire, not in the first blush of youth. It's different when if you've got kids. When you're younger and your kids are young, there's that obviously the horrors of meeting other parents at school and that sort of thing. But I think once your kids have kind of grown up a bit, you don't really meet people. So it was nice to meet Claire at this wedding. And we realised very quickly the two of us have a very, very similar sense of humour. And it was also very clear the two of us are both feminists and have always been feminists. So I think that we had a real kind of meeting of the minds, and we talked about real crime podcasts and why it is that, so I'm talking, this is back in Must have been, was it 2019, Claire? Because we launched in 2020. It was coming up to quite a nice anniversary this year, Claire.
Oh,
It'll be
is it?
7 years.
What are you getting me?
Don't know, 7's my lucky number. I feel like you should be getting me something. Anyway, so we met and we talked about women and their interest in true crime podcasts, which, if we're honest about it, are really just the stories generally of women being murdered by men. I mean, they're almost all.
I jumped up and down and clapped my hands when I read that in your book. I
It's
feel
really
exactly the same way. Yeah.
So it's interesting, right? So when I met Claire, I was listening to true crime podcasts, really enjoyed them. And I think we talked about different reasons why, it's partly a kind of a like validation that life is dangerous for women. I'm not just making up. Lots of women do get murdered, and generally by people that they know, obviously, but also thinking about what to do to avoid getting in that situation yourself, which I think largely is avoiding men, but specifically not getting into cars with men or white vans. That's very important. And then thirdly, what sort of trace evidence to leave behind. Now, I'm joking about that, but also I'm quite serious about it because men don't seem to get done, as we would say in the UK, with the crimes that they do often. So I think we had a mind to those things. And although the conversation was like funny, at the same time, it showed both of us we had pretty similar core values and that we're both quite interested in justice, partly obviously because of Claire's job, her lawyer background, and especially being a criminal defence lawyer and being a what's now a King's Counsel. At that point, she was Queen's Counsel. And I have an interest because I come from an educational background and I often work with what might in the past have been called disaffected youth, sometimes who might end up on the wrong side of the law, often not really through their own choice, essentially. So I think we realise there are various things in common there. And I am a novelist. I write fiction usually. And I'd said to Claire that I wanted to do a podcast, but I didn't want it to just be a standard book podcast. And Claire kind of went, And I now know that she was having an idea. And she said to me, is it okay if I get in touch with you in the coming weeks? And I was like, yeah, of course. So she did.
You don't want to meet somebody and immediately spoil a burgeoning friendship by going, I know we've chatted about feminism for a while. May I introduce you to my views on witchcraft?
Well, so Claire said to me, I've got this idea, just hear me out. And I heard her out. And it was an area that I knew nothing about at all. Now, that's rare for me to admit that I don't know something, because even if I don't, I'll pretend that I do know it. But I really knew nothing about witch trials, even though I moved to Scotland when I was 5 and I grew up in Scotland. I grew up in Fife, which is about an hour, where I live is about an hour north of Edinburgh. So very much, in the thick of it where witch trials occurred, Fife, that was a real hotbed. And, I knew Edinburgh quite well. And I had no concept at all of the witch trials. And as it turns out, really no understanding of Scotland's history at all, because we didn't get taught it in schools. And I think that was a very deliberate ploy, that we didn't know our own history.
Yeah.
So we learned about things like the Industrial Revolution. And of course, that did impact Scotland. But we learned about the First World War and the Second World War. And I did history right up to the end of high school and considered it for university. But there was no focus on Scotland really at all. So everything that we've done through the campaign has really been new to me. Like even understanding the kings and understanding who King James was. I didn't make the connection at all that King James is King James Bible, King James. And I'm an English teacher and I've taught Macbeth lots of times. And I knew that Shakespeare had written Macbeth for the king, didn't put 2 and 2 together with that. Just love teaching it. It's really good. It's gory. Kids really enjoy it. But I didn't really think about witches because it wasn't something that was on my radar at all. So Claire explained to me and it became really clear. You just hear the stats of it. So, about 4,000 people were accused, 2,500 people were found guilty. 85% of them were women, like that. So immediately I'm kind of like, well, why? Why were, and I knew why, because I'm familiar with the story of Adam and Eve. So that's why.
The scale of it shocked me reading this book, because I've read about it lots in different parts of Europe and even modern witch craze. And the scale of what happened in Scotland is really shocking. I didn't know.
Yeah.
There's a few reasons for it. One, as Zoe's just touched on, James VI became obsessed with the idea of witchcraft. So at the same time as the Reformation Church were solidifying its power and getting rid of Catholicism and all Catholicism's rituals and adorations of statues. So you had the church trying to crack down on idolatry and any other forms of power, and saying God is the one that you have to look to, and the way through God is through us, is through the church, is through the way we pray. Don't go to anyone who seems to be freelancing
Right.
spells or anything of the likes. So you had the church saying that and being ever present in people's lives. Then you had the king, the state, from the highest authority saying witches are afoot. They are in this kingdom and they're trying to do bad, and we have to be on guard for it, because if we're not, then Satan's realm will take over Scotland. And the third thing, which was a critical thing, even with both those other two factors, was we had really quite a sophisticated court system at the time. We had easily available courts in the central belt that people could get to. So when accusations were made, they could usually, in the central belt of Scotland, the sort of middle part of Scotland, be ventilated in a courtroom. And those things together made a really, really terrible mix in respect of accusing people. And that number 4,000 is, we think, a very conservative number. And the reason is, firstly, the first set of witchcraft accusations got inverted commas out of hand so quickly that the Privy Council in Scotland, Scotland's highest body, the government's chief advisors, put a stop to all trials at one point and said, we cannot go on like this. We are only going to allow you to prosecute if you come to us and show that we've got a case for it first. And we will give you basically a permission, and you can take that permission and you can have a trial. So that first set of trials, we don't have good records for at all. And that was the one which made it, get really out of hand.
So they went crazy for a little bit, and then the government set up a commission of sorts to like have a hand in it and regulate it and control it, yeah?
Yeah, to regulate the prosecution, because what was happening was courts all over the place, like farmer and landlord courts or local civic courts all over the place were trying people for witchcraft. So they said, no, you have to come to us and you have to show that there is a prima facie case. You either turn up on your horse from wherever you've galloped in from to say, we've got a confession and here it is, and here's the men of the parish that saw the confession, and this is the signature of the men that have heard it, and we got an expert in, a witch pricker, and the witch pricker came in, and we'll maybe talk about that later, about expert evidence, and then they would present that to the court, and the court would either grant you permission to have a trial for witchcraft or not. But the records are really, really poor in Scotland for a long time. For example, in parish records, there are entries that say, on this day, sundry witches were executed. Well, we don't know what sundry. Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 3? There's a lot of guesswork involved over and above how many, the 3,890, whatever it is, names that they've actually got. The actual provable ones get to about 4,000. But in fact, we reckon it's quite a lot higher, because the research that was done for that number, the 4,000, was taken from something called the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, which you can find online. And our academic pursuits are limited by time and finances. So maybe if they did more money and more time, we could have dug up more names.
So tell me a little bit about how have you unearthed part of this history, and not just you, but like citizen scientists or historians. How does one unearth this history?
Claire mentioned their survey of Scottish witches. They did a tremendous job. And what they did was they used records that they could find, in church parish records, that sort of thing. And that built up a picture. But then there's also, on top of that, there are people at the moment that are working in various places across Scotland that are either independent scholars, independent historians, or they're not necessarily historians or not trained anyway, but they are using the archives in their local area or maybe names that are in their family to try and to beaver away and find what they can to build a more complete picture. But I mean, sadly, and this is one of the things, so the book that we've written, I just read the criticism today because I can't help myself, and somebody's written, I would have liked to have had more detail. And I was like, yeah, so would I, bud. But this is what it is. And if I give you more detail, I would just be making it up, because it's really, really sad, because the people largely that were accused, they weren't powerful people. They were ordinary people. They were probably unable to read or write. So the stories that were left, as is always the case, would have been people that had a bit more money or a bit more power. But then, of course, they didn't tend to get accused as much because they had power. So it tended to be people that had less power, which is always the case as well, who couldn't afford to pay for legal representation to get them out of the situation that they were in. So we have very, very scant details. If you look in the survey, we do a podcast, and every episode we give names of different people that were accused, and it might be that we've got a guest that's from a particular area one episode. So we'll go and we'll have a look in that area and see what we can find. And we did one 2 weeks ago, and I went and looked up names, and I was looking just at the area that I live in, the area I grew up in, and I found 2 women's names, and all it had really was the year and the date that they went to trial and their names. That was it. So it didn't say if they had been found guilty. It didn't say if they'd been executed. It didn't have ages, jobs, nothing. And that is often the case. So it is incredibly scant. And I think for obvious practical reasons, but I think also because I think people must have in some way realized that this wasn't okay, what they were doing,
Yeah, but also, like you said, I had a conversation with an Indian scholar, Kovan Kelkar, who wrote a book about modern witch hunting in India. And she said, any population that is without resources is vulnerable to violence in the community.
Oh, yeah.
And I do want to get into the fact that it was mostly women and the gendered nature of this. And obviously, like you mentioned in the book, women weren't trusted, believed, or their witnessing on their own behalf of anybody else's behalf didn't count for anything because they didn't have, worth or citizenship in that way. But I did want to say, reading the book, and in particular, the portraits of the accused, I had a very emotional reaction to it. It is so being able to put yourself in their shoes, just understanding how frightening it must have been to live in these small community and all of a sudden sense that people are looking at you different, or, some accusation is coming your way. Just what a terrifying.
Yeah. I've just read a really good novel. You could tell it was based on a lot of research. And it was by Olga Raven. It's Ravn. It's told from the point of view of a wax doll that's been created and like a puppet, the witch is used to do evil, basically. And the puppet tells the story and so is able to roam in and out people's minds. But one thing that's really useful about that is that it shows that if they had that belief structure, that it wouldn't take much to tip people over into actions that they then just couldn't take back. And there's a really interesting court scene where these women are accused, don't want to spoil it, but the women are accused. And then somebody kind of goes, hang on, this has gone too far. I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't want for this to happen. And the person that's running it basically kind of goes, well, tough. We've started now. Now we have to finish. She's a witch. And the punishment for being a witch is death. That's what's going to happen. And that's it. And I think that is the way that it played out generally, that somebody would make an accusation for whatever reason, whether because they genuinely believed the person was in league with the devil. I think sometimes now the modern interpretation from some people can be a bit like, oh, it was just a way of getting rid of powerful women, or it was just a way of getting rid of women that stood up to the man. I don't think it is that. I think that's quite a satisfying modern take on it, because it sort of gives the accused a bit of agency back again. But I think it was that they genuinely believed they were Christians. This was their belief structure. The way that worked at the time was that the devil was out to get the king, because the king was the figurehead and had been put there by God, and that if they brought the king down, then they would bring down the good and godly nation that was Scotland, and so they were really, really defensive, I think. And I think they really believed that the devil was going out into communities and turning women's heads. And, and I think alongside that is a fear of women, I think in society, a fear of women's bodies, like a kind of a deep fear of women being able to conceive and to give birth and periods and all that kind of thing. I think there is a real fear about that. And I think all those things played together. And you could see that once you set that in motion, be very hard to bring it back again.
Absolutely. And what you also describe in the book, the fact that the church is so enmeshed in people's lives that not only having to go to church like 3 or 4 times a week, but having all like important life events happen inside the church in front of the clergy and whoever was in charge, and that you were kind of subject to the congregation and the judgment of the higher ups in the church all the time. They were in charge of making you toe the line like you describe. And so I think it's hard for maybe us to understand now that kind of influence.
I don't think it's actually that hard. I think if we look at the way society is just now, I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, like 10 years ago. But I think now, because we're not in a village where we attend church, but we are in an online society where we attend social media, and people watch what people do that are involved in that world. And I know not everybody's on social media, but pretty much everybody's on social media from a certain age point. And I think that if you step out of line, then there will be people that will say to you, right, you have broken the rules and we will now punish you for that. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's just a really big part of human nature. I don't think we necessarily punish the right things. And I don't think we necessarily punish them proportionately, but I think that is still there. And there are people that set themselves up as being, I am the arbiter of what is moral and what is ethical. And I think that changes, but I think that we've often got our eyes on the wrong things, and as ever, we're not looking at power and money and holding them to account. We're looking at people that can't necessarily stick up for themselves. I think the same with the witches, as is happening in Britain now with, the whole ridiculous stop the boats movement that's happening in America with ICE agents. I think we can see those things. It's the same sort of thing happening. There's a rot at the center of things, but instead of dealing with that, we blame other stuff.
The parallels are stark at the moment. I just watched a video of an ICE agent dragging a pregnant woman through the snow, kneeing her in the neck,
And the images of the police in Berlin battering protesters that are protesting about what's happening in Gaza, that has now become ordinary. That's become something that we, psychologically normal people recoil from, but that we've got no way that I can see of pulling that back again, back into the light and out of the darkness. And it must have been the same during the witch trials. And then it was much more fragmented because you couldn't speak to somebody else in the country. So if you wanted to progress with your witch trial, you had to get on a horse and ride down to the Privy Council who would give you permission. People weren't connected in the same way as they are now. But bizarrely, that pervasive idea about the devil and witches was spread right across pretty much Scotland.
Yeah, and also if you're told by your king, the penultimate power, that you're all individually in the business of protecting your country, and if you weren't accusing, you might just be accused.
Yeah.
I found that so fascinating.
That's a really interesting aspect of it, isn't it? Because sometimes when we'll get men who are trying to kind of prove a point to us and they'll go, well, many of the accusers were actually women. What do you have to say to that? And I'm kind of like, well, that's how patriarchy works. It's that everybody buys into the stupid bloody structure and people are scared. So you'll get some people that are able to stand up for themselves and will pay the price for that. You get some people that bury their heads in the sand, and you get some people that sense that if they stand next to the seat of power, like say somebody like Erica Kirk, who sees that's her chance for power, you're going to go and move over there. That, to me, is really incredibly obvious. That's how patriarchy works. If you as a woman don't have the same power as a man, some women who maybe don't have integrity will move across to a powerful man in order to protect themselves, but also to make money or to garner power or, whatever. I think that that's incredibly obvious. It doesn't then go, so you see, and I would have a light bulb moment and go, yeah, feminism is stupid. You're so right.
Pockets of the patriarchy.
It's infuriating because it's not the gotcha But they never, it doesn't matter when you kind of go like, here's the logic. They don't go, oh yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I keep telling Zoe to stop arguing with people with facts on the internet. Nobody is interested in facts. People are just interested in their feelings.
I'm interested in facts and feelings, Claire, and in a good world, there'd be room for both.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
But the easiest way to nix that whole argument to begin with is that there were no women in power. There were no women up and down government, up and down law, up and down anything. We had no power.
Yeah. Ironically, there were only 2 women in power during that period of time. One was the woman who signed the Witchcraft Act. That was Mary, Queen of Scots. That was James VI's mother, and she signed it not under duress, but she signed it to keep her new parliament, which was Protestant, happy. So she was a Catholic woman, very staunchly Catholic, as history records. And she probably realised that the Witchcraft Act, when it came in force, was more to do with suppressing Catholic idolatry, these sorts of rituals and spells and those sorts of things, than anything really to do with witchcraft. Because when the Witchcraft Act came into force, Scotland wasn't ablaze, that's probably the wrong word, with witchcraft accusations. It wasn't until Mary's son took power in his early 20s that the witchcraft accusations really, really took off. So we've got Mary who signs the Witchcraft Act, and then we have Mary's cousin, who is the Queen of England, who eventually has her, Mary, executed. So there were 2 women in power, but they weren't any help to anybody during this period of time.
Yeah, and they may have existed, but there weren't numbers of women up and down the bureaucracy of the governmental machine.
No, in fact, the person who probably wrote the Witchcraft Act was John Knox. And John Knox in Scotland was so anti-women being in power, he wrote a book called The Trumpet Call Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. And basically that was his thoughts on how, with all due modesty, something had gone wrong because God had accidentally let 2 women be in power. Which is, quite a big take on it from John, but most people agreed with him eventually. And it showed you, there was a book I read recently that said of both him and of James VI, in a time of misogyny, they were notable misogynists.
Can I just say what the title of John Knox's book was? Because he wrote a good title. You have to give him that. So the book was called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. I mean, that's the regiment I'd want to be in.
There you have it. There you have it.
That's the regiment you are in, Zoe. It's the Clan Witches of Scotland, quarrelsome dames thereof.
Yes, true.
Yes, I do want to get to the quarrelsome dames part, but I also wanted to just touch on, so there was another important text written by James VI called Demonology. And I love that chapter where you talk about actually looking at it and finding out what it is. And I also the parallels. So that was a how-to manual in a sense, as is your book, a how-to manual stepping through all the steps of accusing, trying, and killing a witch.
Yes. I think it's worth noting at this stage that although our book is a tongue-in-cheek, I know you get this, Elle, it's a tongue-in-cheek, manual for how to kill women. It's not actually a manual of how to kill women, because we've had a couple of people get in touch, say to us, this is very dangerous and incredibly irresponsible. Why have you written this book? And we're kind of like, no, it's like making a joke. We're Scottish. We make a joke about things that are really awful. And it's saying, this is how they did it. This is how they killed women. This is how they, they kept everybody in line. That's where that comes from, because James had written his book, which was, Claire, you'll describe how it's structured, the book.
Yeah, so Demonology was a book written by James, and it's written in 3 parts. The first part was your sprites and your ghouls and your spirits. So basically, in the time before witches, the main spiritual enemy were ghosts, things that go bump in the night, that kind of thing. That's book 1. Book 2 is about witches, and book 3 are about a sort of roundup of all the other things of the other world, including succubus and incubus. Is that right?
Funny combination of different. I think it's really odd. It's like a real kind of Halloween anthology.
Yes.
It is. But so the book's split into 3 parts, and our book's split into 3 parts: the long past, the present, and the future, I suppose. And the book, it also is a how-to manual. In relation to witches, it's set up as a conversation between a master and a student, and the student's a doubting sort of person. He's not quite sure if witches exist and what they're all about, and the master puts him right and explains to him all the curious questions he has in relation to witches. And there are 7 questions, 7 major questions that allow for discussions to take place on witches. And it's those 7 questions that we look at in the book. We faithfully copied from the book what was there, and then I had to be pre-seed very significantly, because otherwise that chapter would have been absolutely ginormous. But it's amazing in Scotland, you can actually go to a library and say, I would like a copy of Demonology, and they can arrange for that to happen. And you go into a wee library and they pull down the shutter so it doesn't get sunlight.
Not just any library, Claire. That makes it sound like they're any library up and down the
Local
land.
library.
It's the national, it's your local library because you're from Edinburgh, but it's the National Library of Scotland. And it's not just any copy of Demonology. It would become too blasé, Claire. It's the first edition of Demonology. It's really easy to join the library and then they go and get it for you. And Claire's saying you go into this little room and it's, the temperature controlled and light controlled and everything. But you can go and see literally the book that started all this, really, that really started the ball rolling. But it's not a big book, is it, Claire?
No, it's a tiny wee book. I wanted it to be like the Disney bumper book of spells. I wanted it to be like Mickey in Disney, where he opens up the book where he's washing the floor. What one's that?
Fantasia, I think. Yeah, it's small, which is quite useful and actually quite clever of him, because it meant that it's not a big, massive, weighty tome, and it's something that would be easily carried around. It was a massive bestseller. It was really taken up and was running for a long, long time.
In fairness, there were only about 3 or 4 other books printed at the time. And his other bestseller was the King James Bible, his own Bible. Do you know, though, interesting fact, he had another follow-up book, less successful, unfortunately, about the evils of smoking. But the thing is that what Demonology sets out, and it's really interesting actually, at the start of it, Demonology says, I'm not writing this book to show you how clever I am. I don't need to do that. I am writing this because there are voices today that say witches might not be real. And those voices are ill-informed. And if you listen to those voices, that's how the devil will creep in. So I am here to tell you that they are real, and I am here to show you how to kill a witch. I'm here to show you how to identify a witch, what they do, why they go over to the devil, why it's women, how they travel, how, if they can do acts of witchcraft, how they aren't able to do it when they're arrested, why people putting them into custody don't get spells put on them. All these questions that people would ask, he was there to answer. So folk might say, oh, well, if you think she can turn herself into a bird, why doesn't she turn herself into a bird and fly away when she's accused? And Demonology provides the answer. It says, because if you are righteous and you accuse someone, brackets, a woman, of being a witch, if they are not a witch, God will intervene. He will not let a righteous person be accused. And if someone who isn't righteous is accused, i.e. a witch is accused, God will stop them from using their power to escape lawful arrest. So there was an explanation
for everything.
To help people who would be sitting there thinking, well, it's a bit odd that she's a witch. Why would that be? Why wouldn't I know about it? Why is it always women that are witches? And every part of it, James provided an answer to.
I don't think you can overestimate the impact that had on the outcome of things, why it became so many.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the whole question of who was being accused and who was doing the accusing. And I mean, is there a creepier character than Witch Pricker? I don't know. It feels like, are these the serial killers and serial rapists, the forefathers of, like, they're just such grotesque characters to me.
Yeah.
But can you explain a little bit about what witch pricking was, why it happened that way, and who they were? And
Witch prickers were brought in, they were men, and they were brought in when somebody had been accused, because it's one of the ways of proving, quote unquote, that the accused was a witch. Because the idea was that when the devil did his reverse baptism, so everything that the devil did to these so-called witches was a subversion of what happened in the Christian church. So he'd use churches, he'd sort of defile churches by using them sometimes. And what he'd do is he'd claim everything from crown to toe. He would leave a mark upon the witch's body. Just imagine I'm constantly doing bunny ears around witches here, because obviously they weren't witches, but I'm going to call them witches. So he would turn the witch from being a normal human being into his servant, who had lost essentially their essential self, that they were now just a kind of a super soldier and they weren't really a human anymore. And that's one of the ways in which they dehumanize people that they knew in their communities. I mean, if you imagine, it's like, it's an old woman from the market that everybody's always known. It's a guy that, that runs the cobblers or whatever. These people turn from being somebody that they know in their community to then they can watch them being killed and feel that it's the right thing and that justice has been done. And in order to make that happen, they have to be dehumanized. Now, we are experts at dehumanizing those we want to get rid of as humans. We see it time and time again. It's happening now. That's what we do, is we take away the bits that we empathize with, and then we're left with this badness that must be dealt with. And that's what happened. And one of the things that the devil did was he left a mark upon the witch's body, so that when they were taken into custody, when they'd been accused, they stripped them, they shaved their heads, and they examined the body to look for the mark of the witch. Now, if you were a woman and this happened to you, and your minister was one of the people that was there doing the examining, and it was the elders of your church, and these again were people that you had known for a long time, because people didn't move around very much. So it was people you'd maybe grown up with, your peers, people that you looked up to in your community, and then they were seeing you naked and really examining your body. Just the horror of that is just so terrible. But then to make it even worse, they would then bring in the witch pricker, who had a very, very clever job, which was always paid. They couldn't proceed without the witch pricker's evidence, so he always got paid. And what he would do is he would come in, he would then examine the body, he would jab the body with needles. And there are existing illustrations of sort of trick needles, where the head of the needle would disappear into the body, and so that it would look like they were being stabbed, but they weren't. And it was often that the mark wouldn't bleed, but sometimes it was that it did bleed. And it might be something innocuous like a mole, or, just a scar, or just a bit of discoloration or whatever. He would find this mark, and that would be one of the very important pieces of proof, quote unquote, that this person was in fact one of the devil's servants. And he always got paid, and he got paid per witch as well. So it was in his interest to identify more witches rather than fewer. The more he picked out, the more cash he got. And you can imagine, if you didn't pay the witch pricker, then he'd be kind of like, well, why aren't you paying me? Are you a witch? There's always that threat, because he could supposedly kind of suss out who was a witch.
Like, of all the bills you're going to pay first, the person that could accuse you of the crime that would get you murdered and, burnt, it would definitely be that one.
There's an interesting story. I think this is one of the most interesting things that we looked at, about a witch pricker called Christian Cadell, who was a woman and was in disguise as a man and worked as a very successful witch pricker. If by success you mean making money and identifying innocent people as witches, travelled all over the place and was eventually found out, was caught out, and shown to not be to have an ability to sniff out somebody working for the devil, unsurprisingly. And she was sent to Barbados. And we don't know what happened to her. We don't know if she made it to Barbados. She was killed before then, if she escaped. She had travelled all over the place and had pulled the wool over people's eyes. And we spoke to one historian about it and said, do you think it's that she was a convincing man, Or do you think it's a bit like the Emperor's New Clothes, where you wouldn't then say to the witch picker, you're a bit suspicious, because they were so scared of the witch picker's power? I think that's a really, really interesting thing to look at, of where power lies in perception, and those people that then manipulate it to their own ends. Because she was obviously somebody that realized, she must have been like clever, that she was able to talk herself into those situations, keep herself under the radar for so long, make a good amount of money, and then eventually it caught up with her. But I think, interesting to think, I mean, horrific, but interesting to think, well, how best to keep myself safe and make some money? Well, I'll be the bad guy.
And also kind of feed the machine and cooperate in a sense.
Yeah.
And keeping yourself safe that way.
Yeah. It's like some people that are in the public eye now, like I'm thinking about somebody like Erica Kirk, I'm going to mention her again. So her husband dies, very sadly, and she immediately jumps into his space and actually ramps up even more. I'm making a role for myself here because there's all these terrible people, and here I am, and I'm going to help you all to stay in the light. But I think that's really interesting that people sense that there's a power to be had, and they step into that place and they manipulate the belief system to make their own money and make, their own power.
Absolutely. Another thing that occurs to me about the witch pricking is like, beyond that, kind of the sadism involved, the sexual sadism involved just kind of throughout the entire process. I don't think most people, when they think about witch burnings and, the witch craze, really think about the torture portion of it and the sexual sadism. It's significant.
Yeah.
It's really significant. And the sexual side of it is really clear, isn't it, Claire?
Yeah, the witch trial accusations, when you're accused of being a witch, start off with you having to renounce your baptism, because no godly baptized woman would do any of this terrible witchcraft. So that was the first thing. The devil had to put his hand on your head and on your foot, and you had to renounce anything to do with God and say, this whole body of mine is given over to the devil. And once you give your body over to the devil and renounce your baptism that way, then physically your body needs to be given over to the devil. You need to be defiled by the devil. That's the nature of it. And there's something, of course, there's something in the idea that most witches are women, again, because if the way that a woman is dealt with by the devil to defile her is having sex, at that time there wasn't open sexuality between a man, a god, and a man. So again, the idea was reinforced that it would be women that would be having sex with the devil. And they lived, of course, an incredibly, terribly repressive lifestyle, where the idea of sex being spoken about at all by anyone was unthinkable. Meanwhile, what they were doing is saying, and what did the devil do to you next? And what was this like? And, the granular detail it went down to, including getting from women what was his emission like, shall we say politely, and finding out that his, inverted commas, emission would have been cold because the devil was made of compressed air while he was on earth. And as a result of that, this compressed air was freezing cold, and anything that would come from the devil would also be freezing cold. But you can see the very, very sexualized way questions were asked from the responses that are given. No woman goes in and says, right, confess, and she'll say, right, okay, what happened was I did this, and then this happened, and then that happened. These confessions would come about by repeated questioning. Did the devil do this to you? Did the devil do that to you? Was the devil's semen cold? No, it was hot. Are you sure it wasn't cold? Let's come back to that. And then you just ask the questions over and over again until you get what you want. And then you've got your confession. And what began to happen is, because the use of the printing press over this time became more and more common, the stories of the confessions were printed off like pamphlets, and people could then read them in their community. So they would read them and they would know, oh, well, if I've been arrested for witchcraft, I know what they're wanting is, and that became a whole part of the story. People would know and understand what it was that they should have been confessing to, and that's why you get confessions that are really, really similar across places. But there's also that idea of the witchcraft confessions having that element of sexuality. This is in a time before Netflix, before anything. This would be your gossip. This would be your interest. This pamphlet would come out. Everyone would crowd over it, would hear about the terrible, wicked sexual things these women would be doing, doubtlessly getting off on it.
I have to say, it reminded me of pornography. It reminded me of the fact that it is sexualizing women's degradation and humiliation.
It's interesting you say that, because there's a place, I'm not going to give any great detail because I don't want to drive any businesses away, but a guy that runs a place that he calls a museum of the witch trials. And he's got various torture devices and then puts up on social media. But when women come to the museum, I've never seen men getting their photographs taken like this. He puts the women in the head pieces that fit over the head and then go into the mouth. He's recreated photographs of what he thinks it would have looked like when women were killed. And it's disgusting. I just think it's absolutely appalling. We in no way would have that for, say, a Holocaust museum or a museum about slavery. But because it's about women's pain, that's entertainment and that's okay to do. And I've seen pictures of primary school classes that go in and their teachers had that put on, of little girls where they've been put into the torture device. I think it's really wrong. These were real individuals. They were real people. They were women that were going about their lives, and some men too, that were going about their lives and for whatever reason fell foul of what the belief system and the law was at that time. And then they ended their lives in the most appalling circumstances. And were then, even in their dying moments, was used as entertainment stroke enlightenment for the people of the community, so that they themselves wouldn't go and do the same thing that the accused or the guilty had done. And I just think it's appalling that, a few hundred years later, people are paying a tenner to come in and perv over torture devices. I just think it's absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, gross. I think more generally that today's pornography is torture, is based in torture, humiliation, and degradation in a lot of ways. And I just feel like you can draw a line from from the titillation of those years to what is happening now.
Well, if you dehumanize women to a point like that, I think that's the natural, horrific conclusion of it. But I also think, because we live in a society where everything is available online, the ante just rises and rises and rises. And like, what can you do? How can you make this unique? How can you take this further? I think that is just, it's unfortunate. I think it's quite capitalistic. It's this idea that bigger, worse. I don't want to use the word harder, but that's what's happening. It's making it the worst that they possibly can so that money can be generated by it.
Yeah, it is. And your book and these stories gives some kind of origin story to that. And I'm sure this isn't the first event in history that,
beginning about Adam and Eve. I mean, it goes back as far as that in our, so to speak, so-called Western culture, sort of the idea from the get-go, women fucked it from the beginning, and then I've been paying the price for it ever since.
Your fault. You ate that apple.
They just can't control themselves.
There's more to talk about the torture aspect of it, which is so disturbing. The stories of torturing family members in front of victims so they would confess.
That's one story that really, the women up in Orkney who they brought her, she wouldn't confess, and they brought her children in and her husband in, and they tortured them. And it was only when I think they got to her youngest child that she eventually just went, okay, I'm not a witch, but I'll tell you I'm a witch so that you stop doing this. It's so evil, and it's such a horrible, horrible thing. And, you can tell yourself, we're trying to rout out evil. We're trying to get rid of the devil. And this person was evil because they're working for the devil. But I don't know. I just don't think you should be killing people. I just don't think that's okay.
No, exactly. And I think a little bit part of it makes me think of this history is not told. It's not just the history of the victim that's not told, but it's also the history of the perpetrators and the people who did this to women that is hidden and buried.
Yeah. We make the point of that when we're giving talks, particularly if we're giving a talk in school, where, people really want to identify with the accused. So people will say, oh, I wonder if I would be, related to, such and such that was accused in this area. And I always say to people, well, if you can trace your family back that far, you've got a notion that your family was, has always been in Scotland, and you think that maybe we're in this area, I think maybe, that they could have been from there. It's probably statistically much, much, much more likely that actually you're related to an accuser or somebody that was involved, like an elder or the executioner, or somebody that jailed them, or somebody that questioned them, or people in the community that turned their backs on a neighbour, much, much more likely to be related to an accuser. And I think that's, for me, that's a really interesting thought experiment, because then you're sort of like, okay, right, that's much more likely. What would I do in a terrible situation like that? And I think a lot of the time people feel helpless. And I don't think that's really any different now to what it was then.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about your campaign. You have a campaign with some goals, and I would love for you to explain.
So the campaign, after the sort of moment standing with Wojciech the bear and looking at the castle esplanade and thinking about the women that were executed there, I literally went home and wrote out what I would like, and what I wanted was a pardon for those that were convicted. I wanted their name to be changed in history from convicted witches to people that had suffered a terrible miscarriage of justice. I wanted an apology for all those that were accused, because I knew many weren't convicted, but, for example, died when they were being tortured, or were acquitted, but their lives were ultimately ruined, because who's going to help someone who's just beaten the rap for a charge of witchcraft? And there's an interesting dynamic there that we haven't spoken about a lot lately, which is the breakdown of women being able to be friends and talk to one another. Because the bigger your friends group were, and the more people you were in contact with, the more likely it was that if they were brought in and accused of witchcraft, they would name you.
Sure.
So if you kept yourself completely to yourself, you'd be accused of witchcraft, because who's that spooky old woman with no pals? But you had to limit the number of people you were friends with to limit your liability, your possible liability to any one of those people getting picked up and arrested and themselves being tortured, and them naming their friends, you being one of them, as a witch. I think that was quite interesting. Anyway, the three aims were the pardon, the apology, and also a national memorial. So after 2 years of campaigning on International Women's Day 2022, our then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, issued the first ever state acknowledgement and apology to those people who were accused and or convicted of witchcraft. So that was
that's
in
amazing.
Parliament. Yeah, in Parliament on International Women's Day. It was quite a day. We were there with some people from BBC who were doing a podcast about it called The Witch's Pardon, and we were sitting with them in a room watching it live so they could get our live reactions, which was, I think, just a lot of squealing, really. That's what we're doing. And that was amazing. The pardon is ongoing. The pardon has to be dealt with by legislature. We have done all of the preliminary parts of that and are looking when our next Parliament changes next year, and we're looking to proceed with that next year. The final thing is the National Memorial. We started off with a National Memorial thinking of something physical like a statue. That was our idea. And as time went on, we came to realise that it was problematic for a number of reasons. The first is it's very expensive.
Mm.
The second is, what would it look like and where would it be? And who would upkeep it? And the more we got into it, the more complicated it became, because the more groups of people around Scotland were saying, well, it should be here because we had the biggest witchcraft trial, or it should be here because we had the last one, or it should be here. And we are not the arbiters of where a memorial would be. Then we also thought, wherever it is, it has to be accessible. If it's right in the very north part of Scotland on the edge of a rugged cliff, who can get there? Can anyone get there? Is there a point to it if there isn't a good infrastructure and all, for travel and all those sorts of things? And we had come to a bit of a stall, hadn't we, Zoe?
Yeah, well, we just kind of thought, where do we take it from here? And we both knew that we didn't want to become fundraisers or do a fundraising committee. It's just not the best way that we work. We're a two-woman show, essentially, because what it means is that one of us has an idea and bounces it off the other and vice versa, and then we'll take stuff forward. But if you're in a committee, it's so much slower. you have to have so much sort of agreement and discussion. And the two of us are just kind of like, yeah, no, great, let's do it. Let's not do that, which works much better for us. And thankfully, Claire came up with the idea of commissioning a tartan that would work as essentially what we were calling a living memorial, in so much as that people would then use the tartan in their lives. And so, long story short, we commissioned a tartan through Prickly Thistle, who are a mill in the Highlands. Claire Campbell, that runs that there, had a team of 15 people, 14 of whom were women, that were making fantastic tartans up there for various different things. She came up with some different colorways and some ideas, and we both saw one immediately. We both went, no, that's the one, because the colors and the symbolism just really, really spoke to us. And we're in a position now where the tartans start getting made in the spring of this year, and people have been ordering scarves largely, but also kilts. They're going all over the world now. And what it means is that people have got the scarf on. Like, we'll do an event now, and there's often somebody with a scarf on in the crowd, and people will say to them, oh, what's that tartan? Because people are really curious about it a lot of the time. And then you say, well, here is the story. And it means that the story spreads, and that the people that were accused are remembered. And then hopefully that conversation means people will then go and do a bit of research, and they'll find out things, and they'll think about witch trials in the modern day, or they might think about their own country if they're from out with Scotland's past and what their history was. And it's really amazing to us the huge reach this has had.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got thousands of people in touch with us. We're contacted literally all through the day and night, because a lot of people in America are understandably very interested. And it means that there's this constant sharing of the story. So people might come for the tartan, not really fully understanding what happened in Scotland. And then we can direct them to the podcast and the campaign, and then they get upskilled on what the whole story is. And it means it just keeps generating interest, and people are remembering.
We lure them in with the pretty, pretty material. And once we've got them lured in, we're like, ha, feminism and anti-misogyny and history. You have to agree to all of this, or we will not give you a tartan.
Yes.
I love that. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. What we are trying to do is we're trying, in this strange world that we're currently living in, to build community. And part of what we're trying to build is a community of like-minded people who think about the same things as we do, think about misogyny, think about violence against women, and try and build a positive community of people who want to change things and do better. And the word clan in Scotland has been sort of sidetracked to mean your family, right? People go, I'm from the Clan Robertson, or I'm from the Clan Mackenzie. Clan in Scotland is just community. So some clans were just from the places that they were. And we've brought back the idea of having a clan in relation to the Witches of Scotland, and said, right, we want to set up this community. We want to build that community so that there's a large group of women across the world who have got this network, who are a community. And we call ourselves Clan Witches of Scotland. That's obviously the tartan that we have. But one of the very first tests of whether or not you were a witch. Zoe, do you want to take it? Because it's your line.
You know, are you a quarrelsome woman? That's a really clever line of argument and questioning, because if you say, no, I'm not, then they can immediately go, you see, you are, and you're caught out with it. And so we really like the idea of reclaiming that phrase and saying, yeah, we are quarrelsome women. We are the people that all through school were told to stop talking. You know, we're the people that would protest about things. We're the people that rabble rouse. We're the people that say, no, that's not good enough. We're the people that stick up for underdogs. And I think a lot of women take that role. And I think it's really important that women really focus on the fact that we are losing our rights very rapidly. You know, and there are lots of women around the world that have got horrendous lives, that we need to really be active in trying to hold our politicians to account, so that we improve things for ourselves, things don't roll any further back, and that we really think about women across the world. You know, I mean, there's still women being accused of being witches in various countries just now. You know, that's not good enough.
Absolutely. Or women being stoned for their sexual behavior or whatever else. Like, women are being punished everywhere for just being women.
Yeah.
I did an event where I was interviewing a journalist about a book she'd written about the women judges of Kabul, Afghanistan women judges being evacuated from Kabul. And it was just really horrific to think about how quickly things had completely gone back again. They had this kind of period of time where women made great advances, and then very, very quickly it was all just torn away again. And it wasn't just that women couldn't attend school, it was that if you step out of line, you're killed. Like, these women can't go back, their families are in danger. This is not acceptable. We should be beyond stuff like that. We really need to be thinking about our own reproductive rights and about our health and about where money's coming into the country to try and take that away. And that it's all this hideous, like, really right-wing Christian rhetoric. It's not about, like, God's love. It's about controlling people, and particularly controlling women. I think we just have to be really on our toes about stuff like that.
Yeah. People think, or have thought in the past, once you get so far with rights, then you can't go back. Well, you can, and they do, and we have. And there is nothing protective about our society that allows us to say, nah, you can take away all these rights, but these rights stay. Because we don't have a written constitution in Scotland, but even when you do have a written constitution, it doesn't matter if you're in charge of the definition of what things are. So if you say everybody has equal rights, every person has equal rights, but you identify the word person as meaning the person of the family, and the representative of the family is a man, you're still within the law saying every person has those rights, but that person is described as the head of the family. When there are people saying that the way that we should vote is to get the head of the family to take the final vote, to listen to their partners and listen to what they want to say, but them to take the final vote.
We're on a kind of a precipice where there are people really driving that. It's not because they really believe in these things, I think, a lot of the time. It's because it's power and money, like that, and I think we need to be open-eyed about that, and not just also just go, oh, well, it's a done deal, politicians are all dodgy, they're all as bad as each other. I think we need to wrestle that back and remember that politicians work for us. Like, we vote them in. We still live in a democracy. I'm talking about the UK now. We still live in a democracy, largely, and we need to make sure the people that get voted in are people that are actually going to look after our rights.
Absolutely. And I also think don't be gaslit. Don't be gaslit into thinking we're farther along, or that we have inviolable rights, or that we are protected when we're not. And to, like you said before, stay vigilant.
So I think when people say, oh, I'm not political, I think it's really important to remind them of the fact that you're saying you're not political because everything's okay for you at the moment. So if you don't get involved now, you can't come crying later on when you're like, oh, actually, that ended up affecting me. I think that we need to be really looking after the vulnerable, whoever that is, in our society, because that's how we make everybody stronger.
One of the very scariest things to me about The Handmaid's Tale as a book was when the protagonist, as Offred, goes into her work and her card doesn't work, and then her bank card doesn't work.
Yeah.
And going from being an equal, inverted commas, being an equal member of society, or at least a purportedly equal member of society, to being someone who has no rights can happen in the blink of an eye.
Like that.
And it does not matter, and I'm saying this as like a very senior lawyer, it does not matter. The law is not going to protect you. The law just enforces what the rules are at the time.
Yeah.
So you can say, oh, I'm a person with equal rights. You can make all those sorts of claims. It's not going to protect you if the people making the laws are going to have the laws interpreted or change the laws so that the court is powerless to say, you're right, you should be equal.
Yeah.
Just revoke the Equalities Act, right? You don't have it anymore. What's next?
Well, we're seeing how swiftly things change here in the US.
Yeah.
So, we're living through an object lesson in exactly that, how quickly it can just be rugs out.
Yeah. What I sort of can't get my head around is you're getting people that are workers that are voting in people that, like, patently, they're not even hiding it. They have no regard for their health or safety or their rights You're kind of like, why are you voting this guy in? He doesn't care about you. He's the guy that would have been like the overseer, or the manager in the factory. He'd come along and he'd hit you for not working fast enough. What is wrong with you? And people are they're so bedazzled, I think, they're glamored almost by what they see on social media, that they think they're part of some sort of special inner sanctum. Absolute fucking mugs. Honestly, all this talk about they're the lions, a lot of these really racist British guys use that kind of like rhetoric, this idea that these are lions who are now standing up to defend their women and children. What was that? What was the stat? A third of the guys, the men that were involved last summer's protests, riots, had been accused of domestic abuse. These are the men that are putting you in cars and taking you away, and then there's a true crime podcast about it. These are the men that take their women's shoes and put them in the boot of the car so they can't leave the house. These are the men whose children become traumatized because they see them assaulting their mothers. These are not good guys. They're not lions. They're scum. And I think we're falling so far under this idea of going, oh, well, it's a done deal. It's not a done deal. We make up at least 50% of the population as women. We need to rise up. We need to stop letting it happen.
Couldn't agree more. And I see a parallel with the men of that time that you write about, who made a name for themselves and got honor and curried favor from the king on down by giving women up for witch trials.
Yep,
for sure.
Still happening.
I am hopeful, though. I do think that one thing that this campaign's really shown Claire and I is that there are lots and lots of women who are finding their righteous anger and who are kind of like, I'm not doing this. I'm not putting up with it. And you can see it when we do events. You can see women just kind of going, oh, so I'm not on my own thinking that. And there are these other women that think that. And they're really getting some power from it. So I hope that translates to them looking at their voting, getting involved in grassroots, talking to their female friends, talking to their girls. That is how we wrestle it back, is by talking to each other and not taking no as an answer.
Absolutely.
Thank you so very much for this conversation. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for being a member. Thank you for being a member of Clan Witches of Scotland. That's what it's about. It's just about building that community, because if you think that we're helpless, what we need to build is intercontinental communities.
Of solidarity, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of women. So I think that that's the way forward. And I think that's what we're trying to do just now. Build communities that empower women.
Thank you so
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, El Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.